Welcome to Nothing Is Real, a podcast about the Beatles. Everybody thinks they know the Beatles, but how much do we really know? My name is Papa Nez Wilbury.
My name is Atticus Wilbury.
And we're live on tape from Amsterdam and Montreal. Last week we started travelling with the Traveling Wilburys, going through the journey of how they all came into each other's orbits and eventually laid down the track handle with care and emerged into becoming a real group. Today we're going to trace out the second part of that story, what happened next. And when we left it last week, they were all ensconced in Dave Stewart's garden shed, so to speak, getting ready to spend 10 days creating an album from scratch. And in fairness to them, the combined experience, it's not a surprise that they get the job done. They are working solidly for the better part of 2 weeks, and they have something at the end of it.
They do. They have something worthwhile at the end of it. Yeah, it's interesting that they set themselves that deadline to get the basic tracks down, and I think we said this is because Dylan is about to head off on tour. So they've got to get his contributions down, but they've got to write the songs essentially, and with one or two exceptions, these songs seem to be written in that 10-day period.
Yeah. And so they nominally go in with the notion of doing one song per day, which, seems reasonable. If there's 5 writers there, they each just have to lead off on 2 songs each. What could possibly go wrong? And not much goes wrong in fairness to them. Now, we're not exactly 100% certain of the recording order, but there is, as we mentioned in part 1, a little video camera movie that came with the reissue in 2007, which is up on YouTube for you to enjoy. It's about 27 minutes long. Very, very charming piece. Again, in true Wilbury style, and trying to keep people from the outside out, it does all seem to be recorded on video cameras, and it all seems to be George's video camera in particular where all this footage comes from. But if you watch that, it does give us a rough idea. If we take that as the recording order of songs, it does tell us potentially what order these songs are recorded. And remember, Handle with Care is already done and dusted, so they've got a template or a roadmap for what they want to do next. So the first track they apparently lay down is Last Night. And Last Night is very emblematic of the Wilburys in terms of, you can hear again the back and forth. It's not a particularly intricate or complicated song.
No, but as you say, it's absolutely that skiffle for the 90s, that or skiffle for the 80s. It's that sound, and what they're doing is they're kind of drawing on, it's a slightly rockabilly sound, it's a slightly skiffly sound. Those acoustic guitars form the basis of it, and that's more or less it. No, it's pretty straightforward. That's all I have to say. There's not much to it.
It does seem to be led off by Tom Petty, so it's a Tom Petty song, but you can hear all of them in it. And when you watch the little video, you do get this notion of, you see quite clearly exactly how they are working. They are sitting around in a circle, recording their guitars. And when they are doing joint vocals, what's hugely charming is that the 5 of them are recording around the one mic. This isn't although Jeff has his in-studio moments for perfectionism, he also realizes what's going to get the best results, and all 5 of them are recording those joint vocals together.
It's a charming video, as you say, and it's the fact that when it's their turn to take a lead line, they just take a step forward and lean into the mic. I can't imagine that ever happens these days. This is something that happened in the 60s where you had, John and Paul on one mic singing She's Leaving Home. It's incredible to think that is how it was recorded, particularly, as I say, in an era when digital recording is just starting to come to the fore, where sort of the track numbers, there's no limit, and the ability to punch things in and overlayer things. Yeah,
and how Jeff and the engineer worked on it was they put everyone around the mic, because they all have voices of different let's say, loudness,
Yeah.
everyone was given a place to stand on the floor in relation to the mic with a little piece of tape. So everyone had to stand at a particular distance in order so that they'd all come through at the same level on the one mic. But obviously it works a treat. Day 2, we think, is Tweeter and the Monkey Man, which is really a standout track on the album.
It is. I have to say, I think this is probably my favorite song.
Yeah.
On the album, and it's a quintessentially Dylan track.
Yeah.
I think. George says in the video that he really didn't have very much to do with the track. That it was Bob and Tom Petty were sitting there. They had a cassette recorder. They're just throwing. George says these lines which meant nothing to him. It was just Americana, and then he said his contribution and Jeff's contribution was to remember the line that became the chorus, and just then say, right, that's what we're going to take as the chorus, and we'll drop that in. But the whole thing, which is just typical Dylan, not quite stream of consciousness, but one of these very long rambling stories that seems to go nowhere but everywhere at the same time.
Yeah, it's one of these long Dylan songs, very, very verbose, which doesn't have a bridge, which just has a refrain at the end of it. And my memory at the time is, what we said in part 1 is that Dylan was kind of having a bit of a commercial slump, and whether it was right or wrong, I think critics were snubbing him at the time. And I remember the Dylan and the Dead live album came out, and Down in the Groove came out around that time, and Dylan and the Dead got an abysmal review in Rolling Stone, like a 1-star review. And I remember Tweeter and the Monkey Man hearing that for the first time, thinking, my God, this is brand new Bob Dylan. It's fantastic. It's he's Bob Dylan.
He's back. It did seem to serve to break or clear the writer's block that Dylan had. The last few albums, there'd been that live album with the Grateful Dead, but Down in the Groove was largely made up of offcuts and things. There's a couple of tracks held over from Infidels back in 82, 83. Knocked Out Loaded was the same. He wasn't really producing new material, writing new songs. And there is a sense that there was a writer's block at this stage. And I think Harrison said if the Wilburys project did nothing else, it kind of reconnected Dylan with his writing ability. And
Tweeter and the Monkey Man is emblematic, I think, of that very fine balancing act that the Wilburys managed to pull off most of the time, which is it's a bit of fun. There's a bit of a tongue in cheek, but actually these are good songs. And, Tweeter and the Monkey Man, you could think it's not quite a parody song. It stands up on its own 2 feet, but you can also see the trick that's happening at the same time.
Poor Bruce. Poor Bruce. Bruce had gone into bat hard for Bob Dylan at his Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction. I think it was in 85. Empire Burlesque had come out, which is an album that I like, despite the sort of Arthur Baker sheen to it. But Springsteen was saying in that speech, the voice of a generation, and that if anybody else had put out Empire Burlesque, it would be a career high. And he really went into bat. And how does Bob repay him? He just takes the piss with, it's all state troopers and mansions on the hill and abandoned factories. It's very funny.
Well, if there is a second writer on it, it's Tom Petty, who's kind of working with Dylan on it at the time. And going back to this video camera footage, there is fantastic footage of Dylan in the vocal booth singing Tweeter and the Monkey Man, and they talk about how he's fixing lines on the go and dropping them in, and as I said in the first part, this notion that Dylan kind of dials it in or rocks up or is shambolic is not true. He's very engaged. He's on point. He's reading his lyrics. He's a total pro.
He is. I mean, he has that all the way through his career, that he will be changing lyrics right up to the last minute. As the musicians are laying down the backing track, he's either writing the song or he's changing the song. So you can see him, as you say, in the vocal booth with his yellow legal pad, reading the lyrics. And Harrison said he did one pass at it, and then he did the entire thing straight through, and it's the second take is the take. And he dropped in, they dropped in 3 or 4 lyric changes that he wanted to make afterwards. But essentially, it's what you hear is what you get.
And what you're struck by watching that film is actually, for someone who has recorded so much music, how little of it we have in studio on tape to see what's going on. It's actually kind of rare to get decent quality footage of Dylan in his element doing his thing. And you kind of see this happening and you think maybe, you know, he's selling himself short by not showing his process a tiny bit more, but it's part of the mystery of Dylan, I guess. But it's really good to see.
I think this is the point I was sort of alluding to in last week, which is Dylan rarely seems to step outside of the character that he's created. You know, he just creates this shell. And what is so charming about this is that he seems completely relaxed. Yeah. And although there isn't a lot of footage of Dylan in the studio, you get these tales creep out of him being quite aloof or quite remote from the musicians sometimes. But you do get a sense that when he's with George, when he's with these guys, you see it a bit when he's on stage. If you know, Ron Wood pops up on stage, he kind of relaxes into it and he becomes a little looser. But he's very relaxed and very into the moment, you know. Yeah.
The next track up, we believe, is Rattled, which is, you know, this notion that the Traveling Wilburys is modern day skiffle. I think it's truest on Rattled. And this is, you know, Jim Keltner, who's Buster Sidebury, the drummer for the Traveling Wilburys. Good old Jim Keltner and his Jim Keltner fan club days and all the rest. Jim is very much plugged into the notion of, you know, George can make things happen and you kind of do whatever George says, and he's up for it because he's playing the fridge on Rattled, Jim Keltner.
Yeah. Keltner says, you know, he got the call and he didn't quite believe what he was being asked to do, or believe, you know, he's going to get there. But he said when he gets there, sure enough, there's Dylan and Tom Petty and, oh, look, it's Roy Orbison. He said, somehow George had, again, this notion of George had pulled it together. He had willed this into existence. But there's a very funny little clip in that film of Keltner drumming on the shelf of the fridge and then on the radiator grill of the fridge and on bottles that are in the fridge. And it all is part of that slightly shambolic nature.
So the next track then is Dirty World, which again in this film has footage of them all around the mic having hilarious times and genuine friendly laughter with each other.
Again, a Bob Dylan song, you know, and again, very funny. And George is at great pains to say, you know, people take him very seriously, but he is hilarious. And he just said, what are we going to do now? And Bob said, let's do one like Prince. And so, you know, and he said he just started banging away on an acoustic guitar saying, love your sexy body, oh baby, you know. And he said it ends up, it's nothing like Prince, but you can kind of see where they're coming from, and it's again, it's just funny.
It is funny, and you know, it's something that I think that sets Bob Dylan apart, and also people like Leonard Cohen, is that, you know, there's a humor there that a lot of people can sometimes miss in their music. And you know, if you approach some Dylan songs as if to say, you know, he might be laughing with you or at you when he's doing these things, they can become very enjoyable. And Dirty World is really fun. And it has that list at the end where they all, again, it's the second track on the album after Handle with Care. And it has this lovely bit where at the end where they're all singing a line each, and you see them on mic leaning in and out doing their line of, you know, this strange list of what he loves.
Well, but what George said, he just handed people magazines. You know, so he had car magazines, and there was a fashion magazine. So he came up with things like, you know, parts and service. And they were just coming up with phrases, and they just wrote them down. And then they went round in a circle. And Jeff Lynne, you can see them all laughing afterwards.
Yes.
The fact that every time it comes around, it's they get Roy Orbison to sing the line, he loves your trembling Wilbury.
Yes.
And you know, that just in that Roy Orbison voice, and Jeff Lynne is just absolutely creased up every time Roy hits this line.
This line of Trembling Wilburys, not Traveling Wilburys, Trembling Wilburys, yes.
Trembling Wilbury, and there's a kind of you know, slight swear word worked in there. It's a dirty world. It's a dirty world. It's a dirty world.
Yes,
you know,
yes.
they kind of put that in as well. So the whole thing is just a joke from beginning to end, and very clever. And what I would say is the three funniest songs on this are the three Bob Dylan songs.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, he does cut loose in that regard. On the little film, you also see them, recording, hanging out in the rec room, playing guitars. Bob's on bass when they all rattle out Ghost Riders in the Sky and all that kind of stuff. And George says in the piece that it's 6 weeks from the time that they go from playing their first chord to having the album finished and in the can. Next up is Not Alone Anymore, which is the big Roy Orbison kind of focal point on the album. It closes side one on the main record, and Jeff is quite instrumental in this.
Yes, so what seems to have happened is they've written this song. Roy has done the vocal, and then Jeff. Well, nobody seems to really quite like it, the song. They all feel it's not really good enough for Roy. It doesn't serve him particularly well. So Jeff takes it upon himself to just erase everything, change the chord pattern underneath. And I think overnight he does this and just comes up so that they arrive the next day and Jeff has completely retooled the song. Yeah. And I have to say, again, another perfect example of
what Jeff does,
what Jeff does, and getting it absolutely spot on, and it's a fantastic showcase for Orbison.
I mean, a lot of people slag Jeff for his Beatle.
Do they?
They do. They do.
Who are these people?
Tease Jeff in case the word slag doesn't travel around the world the way it does in Ireland. But a lot of people tease Jeff for his Beatle fixation, but there is plenty of evidence of Roy Orbison fixation in the Jeff Lynniverse. So there's a track called Endless Lies, which he recorded in 83 and eventually came out in 86, which if you listen to Endless Lies, if you don't know it, it is Jeff doing a spot on Roy Orbison takeoff, and it's a wonder Endless Lies didn't get dusted down for Mystery Girl or one of those other albums as well. And when he put out his covers album in 2012, he does a version of Running Scared where he gets to again live out his inner Roy Orbison. So Jeff is totally tuned into Roy and what he thinks a Roy Orbison song should sound like, particularly in 1988. The next track up is Congratulations. And this seems to be another kind of Bob highlight. Yes,
this seems to be a song that Bob had in his back pocket, or at least partially written. Petty says, that was really an exception that Bob came in with this song and then the rest of them contributed and finished it off. And again, what makes this song so funny is it's such a serious, such a kind of dour song called Congratulations. It's just funny. Again, it's almost sort of Bob Dylan sending himself up, I think.
Olivia Harrison said at the time, we came back and we went with Jeff's wife at the time to hear what they'd done today, and they played Congratulations, and she didn't know whether to be happy or not. So she took it very seriously, and then it was all over. They all just started laughing and thinking that this was a massive joke, the song. But it does. At the time, it was striking to hear Bob kind of cut through from some of his 80s places, to actually have a song with a group of people. Then the next track up is Heading for the Light. Bit of a jaunty one, Heading for the Light.
Yes, this seems to be very much a George song. There's little bits of kind of spiritual enlightenment aspect coming into the song. So it's where he's perhaps not quite staying in character, lyrically. But it's not a song, I have to say, that kind of registers with me. It's one of the slighter songs.
Yeah, I think
despite being Teen George, I think this is.
No, I think you're right, and I think it doesn't really. It doesn't sound as group-like as some of the other songs. And, if Heading for the Light had been that B-side that he'd shown to Mo Austin might have gone, oh, okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
And that would have been the end of it.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Absolutely.
But what George did lead off in the writing of was End of the Line, which is outside of Handled with Care, is probably the track that most people are most remember most fondly from the project. And George apparently started writing it on a piano, according to Tom Petty, and then it becomes quite contagious in terms of how it all comes together after that.
Yes, this is, I suppose, there's a poignancy to this because of the video and Roy Orbison's absence. But again, it's just a great song and it's a great group performance.
Yeah.
You know, Dylan maybe doesn't feature so heavily, but everybody gets a little kind of cameo. And there's a sort of wistful, nostalgic aspect to it that's carried through into the sepia tones in the video, and yeah, it's probably one of my favorite songs on the album.
And it does pay off as an album closer, you know. So it's great. And so what we have at this point at the end of 10 Days is a bunch of tracks where they're all sitting around playing guitars to either some kind of rhythm track or Jim Keltner playing along as well. And it's not a fully formed album as yet. The legend sort of states that, and then we had the album and everything was great. Yeah. But that's not totally true. But, you know, because Bob's going off on tour, they take it away. It does make you wonder whether there's a version of the album from that May that we haven't heard, you know, the unproduced raw acoustic version of Volume 1.
I would love to hear that. I would love to hear the session tapes for this. And I'm not aware of any bootlegs that have crept out. And again, I suppose that's maybe because of the nature of the recording session. You know, it was in Dave's shed, and then the tapes were taken personally by Harrison and Jeff Lynne back to England to work on. So, you know, there's not much going to leak out. Danny Harrison has alluded to the fact that there are 1 or 2 tracks that were very unfinished. So much so that, you know, he and Jeff worked on a couple of tracks for the reissue. But he has alluded to the fact that there are a couple that they didn't do anything with, that really they were too raw. But if you think about it, there's that first day recording in Dylan's shed.
Yep.
With a different Harrison vocal. Then you've got the early tracks that they do in Dave's shed before Jeff sort of sweetens everything up. You've at least got an earlier version of Not Alone Anymore. I mean, you'd like to think that when Jeff says he wiped everything and replaced the chord sequence, that he made a copy and did that. That he didn't. It
seems like he might have done that. Yeah,
you know, he didn't just erase it. So it does seem to me, I was disappointed that you know, when it was reissued, that there wasn't more of that. But you know, we live in the era of the box set, so no doubt.
Not long till the 40th anniversary. There is little hints on the video footage of what it sounds like before the studio gets adorned. But as you said, what they actually do next is it because George is the ringleader for this project, is that he takes the tapes and gets on a plane, which we also see in the video camera footage of Jeff and George, thick as thieves, on the plane, taking the tapes back to the Friar Park Studios, FP Shot, to try and get the album finished. And what they do in FP Shot is spend another couple of weeks, you know, tidying up the percussion, the solos, some of George's vocals. They put horns on, they track on some horns. Yeah. And we know that Tom and Roy rock up at FP Shot at some point as well. So there might be some other hanging out or vocal overdubs done. I have my own theory that the one track we haven't mentioned yet from the album, which is Margarita, is purely an FP Shot concoction, because it's very synth heavy. It's very different to the rest of the album. It kind of starts off like Las Parablas de Amor by Queen, from everyone's favorite Hot Space. It has this sort of noodly synth line at the start. I'll shoehorn in a reference to Hot Space wherever I can.
You think you think it's more of a kind of in studio confection? I
don't think it's a Dave Stewart confection, or if it is, you know, it's maybe 10% Dave Stewart and 90% FP Shot. It's kind of different. But by the end of it, you know, when they're finished their work in FP Shot, they have an album against all odds. And as you say, there's a bit of contractual negotiation that needs to be done, isn't there?
Yes. So again, they're all on different labels. So they've got a Warner's who are sort of in charge, I suppose, because it's George is in charge. There's negotiation, and again, the holdup seems to be with Columbia Records, which is Dylan's label, and that has echoes of the Bangladesh concert.
Yes.
They weren't too happy back then, and it's interesting that what they do is they actually form a Traveling Wilburys record label. They put it out on its own special label, so that it's not Warner Brothers, it's not Dark Horse, it's not Columbia.
Yeah, the album comes out on the 18th of October 1988, and as you say, it's on the Wilbury record label, distributed by Warner Brothers. And the Wilburys joke is just run into the ground on the sleeve notes that they are all half brothers of Charles, of sons of Charles Truscott Wilbury Sr. And everyone kind of plays along with George being Nelson, Jeff being Otis, Tom being Charlie T, Roy being Lefty, and Bob being Lucky. And as we said, there's Jim Keltner, Jim Horn, Ray Cooper, and Ian Wallace there as well. And it's got sleeve notes by a pseudonym, Michael Palin under a pseudonym.
Yes, Hugh Jampton. You know that old joke.
I don't get it. What's the explanation?
You don't get that joke? That's because you're much too young.
No, I do.
That's a 1950s goon show joke that they smuggled past the censors in the 1950s. People can go and research that.
Research Hugh Jampton.
Yes, watch your settings and filters. But the most interesting thing that I discovered in researching this was the fact that Derek Taylor has written or had written a very lengthy fictional history of the band that Michael Palin then used to write his sleeve notes. But where is this fictional history of the band? I'd like to read Derek Taylor's take on this.
We don't know. At the same time as the album came out, there was the single "Handle with Care," and my memory at the time is, that there was a certain, I wouldn't say low key release, but maybe it was to do with the speed of how it all came together. That the first time I recognized the Wilburys was two things. One was I saw them advertised on the cover of a trade paper called Music Week, and it was just a big logo. And then you were
such a precocious 10-year-old to be reading a trade press.
What age would I would have been about 14 at the time. And yes, Music Week was a publication that came into the house. And there was the logo was on the front. And then, it wasn't, when somebody said, "Hey, did you see who's in that band?" that you kind of went, "Oh my gosh." It wasn't totally apparent from the advert what they were advertising. You really had to go looking for the information that it was George Harrison's new band.
Please tell me you kept that. You've got that wraparound ad.
I do not.
And it's a.
I should have, but I'm sure somebody scanned it and put it on the internet. But the other thing I remember from the time was, the first time I heard it was seeing the video for "Handle with Care" on Night Network, which was ITV's overnight television show, and they used to show videos. And my memory was they showed it, and I was watching this, going, "Holy moly! Like, there they all are. This is insane. There's Bob Dylan." And then when they cut back to the presenter was phenomenally sneery about all these old farts, and that's a terrible record, and let's just that's a load of crap and all the rest. I was quite indignant as a teenage Beatler at the time.
Well, we did not get the music trade papers in my house, but so I did not know this record was coming.
Yeah.
I just had no advance warning, but I do remember walking into Woolworths. Do you remember Woolworths record store?
Yes.
So the general store, and seeing it on the rack and picking it up and looking at the front cover and thinking that looks like George Harrison and Bob Dylan, because there's nothing on the outside. There's nothing to indicate. So and buying it on that basis. But yeah, it completely blindsided me. I wasn't aware it was coming at all.
Yeah, that was kind of the same with the Music Week thing, is that it's not obvious to say that this is what happened next for all of these guys. So the album comes out. I also recall, before buying it myself, I made a friend of mine buy it so I could listen to it. That's kind of the currency of music in those times.
I was going to say that set the template for your
for a lot of my a lot of my listening in future years. You listen to it first and tell me how good it is.
You buy that box set.
But what we sometimes forget is that it is successful. Like, I mean, like, of course, George is coming off the success of Cloud Nine, but you know, it is a huge commercial success. It reaches number 3, the album in the US. It sells 2 million copies in its first 6 months. It reaches number 16 in the UK, which seems oddly low in retrospect. It ends up being triple platinum in the US, and Handle with Care. Although it only gets to 45 in the Hot 100, it gets to number 2 in the album Rock Tracks, and it's a song that, you know, sometimes you don't know when songs come out, are they going to hang around or go the distance? But Handle with Care certainly it still gets played today. It still lasts. And, you know, it's worth pointing out, maybe people didn't realize, it is about the Beatles.
It is about the Beatles. Definitely is about the Beatles.
You know, when he sings about, you know, stuck in airports terrorized, that's the Philippines.
Yes, it seemed very clear. That's the one thing it did seem to me at the time. This is him talking about being in the Beatles. This is him talking about fame and the price of fame, and you know, he's been terrorized. And definitely, absolutely, it's about the Beatles.
So the window is, though, quite small, because the question is, you know, what are the Traveling Wilburys going to do next? And End of the Line gets earmarked as a second single. But then, as we all probably remember, if you were there, is that just a few weeks later, after the album came out, on the 6th of December 1988, Roy Orbison died suddenly. And, you know, in some ways, I think the Traveling Wilburys ended when Roy died, in spite of what happened next, which we'll talk about in a second. But I think it made everything else it just changed everything.
I think it changed the dynamic entirely. I think you're right. It changed the sound of the band.
Yeah.
And it changed that, the sort of inner workings of the band, of the relationship. I keep saying band, you know, maybe get on to at some point talking about whether is it a band? Is it a band in any real sense? But I think it certainly ceased to be that.
Yes.
When Roy died.
Well, there was, as we said, that kind of Bob Roy, you know, dynamic, you know, with George in the middle and everybody being deferential to Roy. You know, I think Roy was what took it out of the, you know, rich rock stars having a laugh kind of thing, and gave it a certain legitimacy. I mean, the other argument you could say about Traveling Wilburys Volume 1 is, you know, is it not just a version of, you know, George Harrison's Cloud 10, you know, the sequel to Cloud 9?
Well, do you think it sounds the same?
It has I mean, it's George and Jeff doing their thing, so you can certainly see a lineage.
What I do like about Wilburys Volume 1 is it's less of the Jeff Lynne sound.
Yeah.
You know, there's a kind of cleanness, a slickness to Cloud 9 that doesn't follow through. It's got little bits, like I don't like the little keyboard runs on Tweeter on the Monkey Man. That's a very Jeff Lynne sound in the chorus. But those acoustic
guitars,
like
Congratulations doesn't sound Jeff-like.
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, that's a song that really does not have Jeff Lynne's heavy hand on the computer or on the production console. But I think the ethos of you know, When We Was Fab seems to be the sort of song that it comes out of that. You know, where they're looking back. Handle with Care seems to sit between When We Was Fab and that song on George's Best Of, Cockamamie Business, where again he's talking about his role in the business. So I suppose there are parallels, but I don't think it's Cloud 9. It's Cloud 10, Cloud 9.5, maybe.
So Roy Orbison dies, and Tom Petty tells the story in the Peter Bogdanovich Running Down a Dream documentary of how you know, he is telephoned by George Harrison to break the news. So this is, you know, 6 or 7 weeks after the album comes out, and George rings Tom to tell him that Roy has died. And there's a beat, and Tom recounts that George said to him, "Aren't you glad it isn't you?" Which is a quite an amusing an interesting thing to say. But, you know, in subsequent interviews, George says, you know, what he normally says in these things. He said the same thing about John Lennon, which is, well, you know, he's just left this earth and he's still around us and he's still about and he's just shed this skin, et cetera, et cetera. So he used his Georgeness to try and cope with it.
Yeah, there's an interview where you've got Jeff and George and Tom Petty sitting on a sofa, and the interviewer throws that question, and George is saying, well, life goes on within you and without you. And
yes, he does say that.
He's on the astral plane, and we'll see him again. And Jeff Lynne is sitting sort of in his usual inscrutable, behind his aviator sunglasses and afro, and Petty looks really quite uncomfortable. I think at that point he's kind of looking down and not one. And George is the one that's talking quite normally. There's not. He's not showing a lot of emotion.
No,
and I don't think that's put on. I think that's just his genuinely held belief. But it's 100%. Uncomfortable. It's that thing. It's uncomfortable when people start talking to you about their religion, and there's an element of that.
Yeah.
In it, and the other two are just sort of saying, "Well, okay, well, they're just sitting there, and we let George deal with that." But Jeff Lynne, I think, seems to be particularly affected. He makes a comment about it was just the most sickening thing to hear, and we had great plans, and Roy and I were going to work together again. And you get a sense that was something outside the Wilburys. They were going to do another album, and of course, at this point, Mystery Girl hadn't come out yet.
Mystery Girl still hadn't come out, and when Roy died at the start of December '88. He had just been over to Europe, and he had debuted the song "You Got It" at a music awards show in the Netherlands. That's where the footage from the video comes from. And he'd apparently been unwell when he travelled to Europe with chest pains, but hadn't really acknowledged the significance of them at the time. And so the death of Roy Orbison could have meant the end of the line for the Wilburys.
See what you did there.
See what I did there. Or possibly, Roy could have been replaced, or should they even go on at all? Should they have gone on a break? Because I think we should go on a break, and we shall talk more Wilburys after this.
End of part one. Intermission. End of intermission. Part two.
Welcome back. So there was an initial thought of having people in to replace Roy Orbison, because the first thing they do without him is the end of the line video, and that's apparently recorded or filmed the day after his funeral. So the four of them are at the funeral the day before, and then the next day they're doing this video. Again, there's raw footage of that on the Wilburys documentary, and they're kind of jamming and hanging out, and in some ways you're kind of glad that they have each other.
Yes, that was interesting. Even on the film set, they picked up guitars, and they're playing, and Bob's drumming, and so it seems to be. I suppose it's like a wake. It serves that function.
And Roy is represented by his guitar in a rocking chair and a photo and all the rest. But it goes to show that there was a commercial concern at play here, that the Wilburys wasn't really a side project. It was selling hundreds of thousands of copies, and a video needed to be done. And there was some names floated around for who could possibly have replaced Roy Orbison, and and George picked up the phone to Paul McCartney and said, "No, he didn't."
No, he didn't. I would love to have Paul McCartney in the Wilburys, just so that George would be saying, "No, Paul, no, sing this. Stand there. No, don't step forward quite so quickly, or don't."
But it does speak volumes that for all his collaborations over the years, Paul has never gone into a thing like the Wilburys, or could never go into a thing like the Wilburys, and that's fine. That's just the way he is.
Yeah, I think this is something we've touched on before, this idea of Paul being in a band, and wanting to be in a band, and that was what he tried with the Wings, and he was took up and down the M1 in the back of a transit in 1972. But he's Paul McCartney. He can't be in a band unless he's going to be in a band with Eric Clapton and Roy Orbison and Bob Dylan, and unless it's somebody of an equal standing, and Paul's not going to do that.
So there were other names bandied around. Jeff was producing Duane Eddy at the time, and he was potentially thought of as a Wilbury. Roger McGuinn was also in the ether at the time. But probably the one I remember in the papers at the time as being a possible replacement is Del Shannon.
Yes, that seemed logical. He was sort of in the Roy Orbison mold.
Yeah, he's pre-60s ish. He has a toe in that era.
He was from that generation. He was working, but George has always said there was never it was never really seriously considered that anybody would replace him. And again, we've touched on this idea that George seems to have had, or supposedly had, of let's get Elvis in the band, let's get a tape of Elvis, and we could re-record over something. That's only one source for that, but again, there's a bit of foreshadowing of Free as a Bird there.
Yeah, we don't know. Again, what we've kind of said is that the Wilburys, could have been a footnote, could have been just a load of fanciful ideas. So we don't know if the Elvis notion ever really got followed through on or not, in terms of, whether they pulled tapes or there was just one of those ideas. But it would have been interesting to pull Elvis Presley tapes and mix them in with the Wilburys. It's worth pointing out, a few years ago, the comedian Neil Brennan put out a tweet reminding us of the ages of the Traveling Wilburys at the time of the album coming out.
These old men. These
old men of rock and roll. So just to remind yourself that when that album came out in October 88, the eldest was Roy Orbison, who was 52. The youngest was Tom Petty, who was 37. Jeff Lynne was 41. George Harrison was 45. And Bob Dylan was 47. So 37 to 52, that's a bit of and these were the people who were being teased for being old rock and rollers at the time.
Jason, I'm older than them all.
Oh together. My gosh, there you go. The puzzle of what exactly are our ages continues. Yeah. Put the pieces together. I'm in between Tom Petty and Roy Orbison, so yeah.
That's where you want to be.
Yes. Steady. There is the Wilburys, though, don't stop. But what does happen next is this kind of onslaught of, in some part, what's the Jeff Lynne hit-making machine takes over for 1989. And if we spend a few minutes answering the question of what each of the individual Wilburys did next, because the curious thing is, going into the project, the most successful person actively at the time is George Harrison. Mm-hmm. And coming out of the project, the person who probably makes the least hay while the sun shines is George Harrison, who, if you were Mo Austin or some other kind of person, you'd say, okay, you've got Cloud9, you've got the Wilburys, you are on a roll. Let's get another album out. Let's think of touring. Let's think of something. And it's all the other Wilburys who actually managed to bask in the sun. So the first album that comes out in January 89 is Roy Orbison's Mystery Girl. And as we said, the lead-off single of that is You Got It. And that's a huge posthumous worldwide smash hit single, written by Roy, Tom Petty and Jeff Lynne. It's definitely of the Wilburys genetics.
It has that sound. I mean, it just has the Wilbury sound, yeah.
And that leads off, Mystery Girl turns into a very successful record, and it's not just a Wilburys type project. Roy is working with Elvis Costello, he's working with Bono and The Edge. There's lots of different people who contribute to that album, all your favorite people. And then that's in January 89. Then in April 89, out comes Tom Petty's Full Moon Fever. So a project that has Jeff involved as the producer for the whole thing, and he co-writes about half the tracks, including, famously Free Fallin' is a Jeff co-write. So that is something that comes out April 89. And the lead-off track for that is I Won't Back Down. And again, as a teenage Beatlehead at the time, that video in the post-Wilburys universe it's like, oh my God, the lineup.
There's two Beatles there. There's George and Ringo.
Yeah.
Of course, Ringo isn't on the album. He's just in the video.
That is, yes, when you actually read the track listing, Ringo is not playing drums on I Won't Back Down. But the video is, George Harrison and Ringo Starr. So 66% of the above ground Beatles. And Mike Campbell from the Heartbreakers on playing George's Strat, his famous painted Strat. And Tom Petty. So again, this is like an alternate parallel universe type, Traveling Wilburys type. It's a mashup of the same group of people, and that's in April 89. So that to me is the shadow of the Wilburys. And it's hugely successful.
Hugely successful. It has the same DNA. It has the same sound. I mean, even kind of lyrically, it has that same. Was it the Apartment song? Oh yeah. Or Zombie Zoo, and those songs sort of still have that sort of
playfulness, really.
Casual playfulness is the word. Yeah, playfulness of the Wilburys project.
Well, even, in the, that album has three big hit singles. There's loads of hit singles, but the big ones are Free Fallin', I Won't Back Down, but Running Down a Dream even, brings in the Del Shannon, myself and Del were singing Little Runaway, so
Yeah.
all these guys are in the soup at the time. The next big important album that comes out is in September 89, and it's Bob Dylan's Oh Mercy. And we're now going to ask the big question as to why Bob Dylan didn't do a record with the big Jeff Lynne noise, because Oh Mercy, Oh Mercy is celebrated as this return to form Dylan album. Yes. It is a great Dylan album, and it's the sound though is Daniel Lanois' sound, because he's the producer of the album, and I certainly think there's a Wilburys bounce that people are paying attention to Bob, and the Wilburys are like, oh, Bob's got songs in him, Bob's great, and people are ready to listen to a Bob album with slightly different ears. But it's not a Wilburys sound at all. Everyone else is doing the Wilburys sound except Bob.
Yes, I mean the only song I suppose is Political World has a kind of Wilburys skiffly sound to it, but shuffle to it, and maybe Everything Is Broken, but Lanois takes it in a completely different direction sonically, and by all accounts, Dylan and Lanois butted heads quite a bit. Dylan wasn't well pleased with some of what Lanois was doing.
Yeah.
He doesn't take direction well, I think. And that's, again, interesting in the context of the Wilburys, where you had 5 people. It's a collaborative affair. There's no one telling anybody what to do, presumably. It was a very short, compressed period of time. It would be interesting to hear what Jeff would do with the material on Oh Mercy, but I just don't think Jeff's perfectionism would work at all with what Dylan. Dylan is very much, you just go in, you record it, and that's it, and you move on. And if you don't get it in the first take or 2 takes, there are occasions where he just works and reworks and reworks and reworks a song, but usually that's from a lyrical point of view. I just can't see the two of them working. Perhaps if they got George on board.
I think the Wilburys is probably how it was going to work between Bob and Jeff.
Yeah.
What happens? I have to say, Oh Mercy also has, my favorite Bob song is potentially left off the album, which is Series of Dreams. But it goes to show that Bob is really in a very good place in '89 creatively.
That's the U2 song, Series of Dreams.
God.
That's why you like it.
That's why it's so good, Stephen.
Is it really? Anyway.
And then, but in October '89, George puts out an album, and logic would dictate that that would have been ripe for another. That's where Cloud 10 should have been at the end of '89. 2 years on from Cloud 9. Instead, he puts out the best of George Harrison, Dark Horse, 76 to '89. Which
catchy title,
very, very catchy title, which has this very dark, non-distinct cover. It's got 3 new songs on it. There's 0 promotion for it. It tanks. It's not a successful record.
It's not a successful record. It's very low key. Everything about it is low key. I mean, George was the one who was probably most active in promoting the Wilburys.
Yeah.
But then he does say, "Oh, I was just waiting for the other Wilburys to finish being solo artists." But you just have a real sense that he doesn't have any interest in being a solo artist at this point.
Yeah. That's the reality of it. It doesn't matter. It matters more to you and me, Stephen, than it does to him, or it did to him.
I think that's right. I mean, one of the things that characterizes George's early '70s career for me, after you get All Things Must Pass out of the way and Bangladesh, which is really a kind of a side project, is the lack of ambition. He's not driven in the way that Paul, for example, is driven to have the number one single to get out there, to tour, to keep pushing forward. George, you kind of get a sense, well, he's done everything he wants to do, and his career sort of just peters out.
Yeah,
towards the end of the '70s.
Like after Cloud 9, he never puts out a full studio album again in his lifetime, and it seems to. It's almost as if the whole Cloud 9 thing although he used it as a means to an end to get the Wilburys done, that he was almost reminded of all the stuff he didn't like about being successful and just the whole hassle of it. And it was nice to maybe, trump Paul in the Battle of 1987, but it didn't answer any. He was getting his spiritual questions answered elsewhere.
I think so. I mean, there is a parallel, I think, with All Things Must Pass. So he gets that album out, and he's achieved that ambition. He's got the #1 single. He's got the big album. He's got the critical applause, and he's got the standing. And he does exactly the same thing with Cloud 9. Then he tops it by being in a group with Dylan and Orbison and etc. And he's kind of done that. And you almost get a sense that he sees going back to being just another solo artist and sticking out another album or another single is maybe a step back. And he certainly has. He gives no evidence that he has any ambition in that respect.
Yeah, he certainly seems to think about, he certainly does what he wants, and fair play to him,
Yes, I mean, the three songs that are on, the three new songs that turn up on that best of are all interesting songs. Cheer Down, I think in particular, is a great song. He wrote that and gave it to Eric Clapton to record for the Lethal Weapon soundtrack, and Clapton prevailed upon him to record it himself. Mm-hmm. And that's a co-write with Tom Petty. So again, there's a little bit, but it's not a Wilburys sound, despite the fact that Jeff Lynne is on there and is helping with production. The other two songs, Poor Little Girl, that has a little bit of a Wilbury feel to it, and Cockamamie Business, if it was about 2 minutes shorter, could be a Wilbury song. It's a little bit too long.
Also, him giving out about the music business again.
It's a little bit, as I say, it's a little bit like Handle with Care Part 2.
So Jeff Lynne himself is also working on his first proper solo album as well, Armchair Theatre, but that doesn't come out until the summer of 1990. But, you could certainly look at all these projects that are around and pull together another Wilburys album from 1989. There's stuff there that's all, as we say, share the genetics. But 1990 is a year that actually the Wilburys do get fired up again. And the first time that the Wilburys reappear in their, official four-man guise is the Romanian Orphan Appeal, which is Olivia's the driving force behind that, Olivia Harrison.
Yes, it's called the Romanian Angel Appeal Foundation, and this is a charity that she sets up, but she actually enlists Yoko and Linda and Barbara Bach. So you have the four wives of the Beatles involved in this charity project. And the first thing is an album, and George sort of takes on to gather up tracks. So you've got a great song by Van Morrison called Wonderful Remark, which was on the King of Comedy soundtrack, but was pretty sort of obscure. Duane Eddy has a song called The Trembler. You see, and again, George and Jeff Lynne are on that. This is where you get Paul Simon and George Harrison duetting on from Saturday Night Live.
There you go, my favorite show.
Your favorite show. Ringo gives a track. Elton John, Stevie Wonder. So this album comes out, and the Traveling Wilburys contribute Nobody's Child, which is really the first thing that they record when they get back together again in March 1990. Not the most uplifting, chipper song
for an Orphan Appeal. And remind me again what Paul contributed to the album. Nothing.
Nothing.
Considering that this was, Linda was involved in the charity, Paul doesn't. But it shows a certain thawing, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess. There isn't a Lennon track. There isn't a Lennon track either. You would think,
Yoko would have dusted something down. Yeah,
there's enough in the vaults there. But it is surprising, I think, that there isn't a Paul track or there isn't a Lennon track. Ringo contributed a live version of "With a Little Help from My Friends," which went on the B side of the 12-inch single.
All the facts.
All the facts. And all the facts, just the facts. Nobody's Child, traditional song.
Which Ringo used to sing. Yeah.
He used to sing it when he was a kid to make his mother cry. He talks about that.
In Anthology.
And there is a recording with Tony Sheridan and the Beatles from 1961.
There you go. So that is a long shadow.
But without George on that track, he doesn't play on that track. So I have to shoehorn in as many facts as I can before you move on to the interesting stuff.
What I remember at the time is that to gain publicity for this, I mean, in terms of world events, what was happening is at the end of '89, the so-called Iron Curtain fell in Eastern Europe, and what was happening in countries like Romania, came to light in the news, and that was one of the triggers for this. But in April 1990. George appears with Olivia on the UK talk show Wogan, which was a 3 nights a week, big talk show at the time, hosted by broadcasting legend Terry Wogan. And it was odd because George's hair is quite grown out at the time. It's quite beetly, his hair on that interview. Yeah. And he's purely there to support Olivia. I don't think I'd ever seen Olivia being interviewed or taking a center stage for anything before. So yeah, you can look that up on YouTube. It's it's a very sincere attempt to try and drum up interest in the charity. But all of that charity work actually comes in the middle of the reactivated Wilburys, and the key date in 1990 is apparently the 26th of March 1990. When they reassemble at Camp Wilbury. And it's a different setup this time because there's more writing up front. Is that right?
Yes, it's much more structured. So the spontaneity that marked that sort of first 10-day period for the first album has gone, and they've earmarked a 3 to 4 week period to really write the material and workshop the material before they start recording. The first song that they work on is Inside Out. And George said, we got that down within an hour of starting. We had worked out the sort of musical arrangement for that. And that's when he says that they were going to be able to pull this off a second time.
Yeah, that's kind of the proof of concept as to whether they're able to, create in this kind of new atmosphere without Roy. And, the first time around, as we outlined, there's a lot of good fortune and happenstance, and this time around they're sitting down to actually do the job, which is always for any project, it's a different kind of vibe or feeling.
Yeah, volume 1, they're sort of jamming essentially, and then making something up out of these tapes. Here, there's much more structure to what they're doing.
But there's something that happens around about this time that we could argue is in the Wilburys universe, but isn't in the Wilburys universe.
Yeah, this is a very odd thing that happened. So 2 days after they start, so on the 28th of March, Tom Petty and Jeff Lynne take a break, and they go off and they record a cover of I Call Your Name with Ringo. So this is Ringo's contribution, or will be Ringo's contribution, to the Lennon tribute gig that Yoko is organizing. That's going to be on the 5th of May in 1990.
This is the Liverpool dock gig that kind of becomes a total fiasco, really.
Car crash. Yeah, it's. I mean, I remember watching it at the time, and the TV coverage was badly presented. The crowds really didn't turn out. George seemingly at this point was saying, I don't want anything to do with this. Paul does his terrible medley live and sends along a film clip of him singing
P.S. Love Me Do.
P.S. I just remember how terrible that was. Ringo's contribution was actually quite good. So he re-records what is a relatively obscure Beatles song, and the band, as I say, is Tom Petty, Jeff Lynne, Ringo, and Joe Walsh on guitar. So it's kind of like the Wilburys.
Yeah,
but it's interesting that George is not prepared to go along to that session and appear on that.
Yeah, and again, it's kind of George just putting his foot down and deciding what he's going to do and what he's not going to do. But Jeff saying, I'm going off to Ringo's now, George, just to record this thing for John Lennon. Remember John? And George saying, no, having none of it.
Yeah, I'll see you when you get back. The flip side of that is it's also interesting that Ringo is in LA, but he's not being invited to come and hang sit out. In. He's not going to come in and replace Jim Keltner. He's not going to be Buster Sidbury for this project.
Yeah.
But Ringo Wilbury would be good.
But that Lennon gig, I would wonder if one of the things that maybe might have kept George away was the involvement of Paul. It is that odd nexus at that time where you can't get all four camps in the same direction at the same time.
I think George is still at this point extremely wary of being dragged into something or maybe tricked into something which can be presented as a Beatles reunion. Yeah. And it's clear that none of the three of them are particularly enthusiastic about the Lennon tribute gig. Nobody is going to turn up in person.
Yes.
This is a tribute to John Lennon. It's in Liverpool, and the other three members of his band are not going to be there.
If memory served, Kylie Minogue turned up. She was very big at the time. I know she's big now, but that was
Kylie Minogue. Was Lou Reed there?
I don't know. It was very strange. Even at the time, I realized this is not good.
I seem to have a terrible image in my head of Lou Reed singing "Mother" while playing an electric guitar. It was not good.
My God, that keeps nobody happy. The Lou Reed fans won't be happy with Kylie. The Kylie fans won't be happy with Lou Reed anyway.
Yep. We're alienating people left, right, and centre. It's very good.
So they have writing sessions, but again, the recording sessions are kind of limited by Bob going back out on his never-ending tour for what eventually turns into the Traveling Wilburys Volume 3. And as a result, George gets Bob to sing everything in advance.
Yes. So once they have the writing out of the way, they beginning of April they start the recording session, and it just seems to be we're going to get Bob to do a lead vocal all the way through on every track.
Yes.
So that he can get back out on the road on the never-ending tour, because it never ends. And then they will, Jeff will fix it in the mix, and the other three will do their vocal parts and do the overdubs. Again, it's one of the things that you see here is the publishing credits for all of these songs are to all four. It's just they all get a credit, whereas if you go back to the first volume, there is more of an insight into how the publishing is broken down. So this is they're sharing all of the writing credits across all of the tracks.
Yeah, because the first album, if you look at the publishing, you can tell which songs George is the lead person on, and Tom is the lead person on, and Bob is the lead person on, depending on the credits. So what happens is, at the time, Tom Petty describes Volume 3 as a little bit more rough and ready, a bit more raucous. And Dylan says himself that the new songs were more developed in comparison to, quote, the scraped up jam tape approach to the debut album, which it's interesting to hear Bob be quite specific about what's going on there. And Volume 3 comes out in October 1990, on the 29th of October, where everybody has new pseudonyms. So Jeff is Clayton Wilbury, George is Spike, Bob is Boo. That's pretty close. And Tom is Muddy Wilbury. And it's dedicated to Roy Orbison as Lefty Wilbury. And my memory of it is that it doesn't really have the impact of the first one. Obviously the element of surprise isn't there. The Orbison element isn't there. And the first single is She's My Baby, which doesn't, it's a raucous, fun song, but it doesn't really have an angle or a depth that maybe A Handle with Care had.
No, but I love that song. I really do. I really do love that song. No, I mean, my recollection is that this album comes out, and it is not. It's well reviewed, but not that well reviewed. And everyone remarks upon the fact that Orbison isn't there.
Yes,
and it changes the dynamic. It changes the sound. So. There's more of a sameness about the songs.
Well, it's a bit like Ringo's Ringo, in terms of Ringo's Ringo album is so good, you don't need another Ringo album. And the Traveling Wilburys Volume 1 is so good. That's it. That's where you should go to for your Traveling Wilburys.
That's pretty much, I think, the attitude that people took at the time.
Yeah.
But
there is good stuff there.
There is really good stuff there, and it is an album, I have to say, that I was disappointed when it came out, and I was disappointed with some of given that they had writing sessions. I think some of the lyrics could do with being sharpened up a little bit, but actually listening back to it again now, where you're not you're well past the disappointment of Roy Orbison not being there. The element of surprise is no longer a factor. It actually holds together extremely well. And where the humor is the fact that Dylan is all over every track.
Yes.
And they put some of the most inappropriate, un-Dylan-like words into his mouth. And it's very funny.
Well, yeah, so She's My Baby has Dylan singing that line. She loves to stick her tongue right down my throat. That one.
It's like,
is that what you're talking to? It's like he's in the room.
mean, that is, I mean, that at the time, I mean, that was side-splittingly funny at the time. But, you know, because Dylan was coming out with stuff in 89, like, you know, The Man in the Long Black Coat and Most of the Time, and these very kind of, and then suddenly he's singing that type of lyric, or he's doing a kind of doo-wop song on Seven Deadly Sins.
Yeah, I remember interacting again. It did come as a bit of a surprise, and first realizing it was coming when the She's My Baby video popped up on MTV, and that opens in the funniest way with just the four of them driving this comedy van. Yeah, very reminiscent of Getting Closer by Wings, obviously that video, yes. But which is the intent, I'm sure. But there's a hidden Wilbury on She's My Baby, isn't there?
There is, the Ken Wilbury.
Ken Wilbury, and should we say who Ken Wilbury is?
Well, yes, this is Gary Moore, Belfast boy, Gary Moore.
All roads lead to Belfast,
That's your quiz question for this week, is where was Ken Wilbury born? So he's not actually credited as Ken Wilbury, but George was giving an interview and talking about this, and he says, that's Ken Wilbury. I hope he's listening in. Ken Wilbury, you're a very naughty boy. You wouldn't appear in the video, but we love him anyway. He's an excellent guitar player. So again, there's this element of Python there. You know, he's not the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy.
And
Gary
Python
Moore was obviously, Gary Moore was obviously not prepared to cram himself into that comedy van for the video.
Well, Python are involved again, as Eric Idle does the sleeve notes this time under another pseudonym.
Tiny Jampton.
I still don't get it. No,
that's a smaller dirty joke. It's not even a joke. It's a joke about a joke.
And even the title of the album, Volume 3, is a joke. That is actually a funny thing to call.
That is funny. I have actually had several people over the years ask me about Volume 2 and is it out of print and can they get Volume 2? So it's a joke that keeps giving, you know.
So the two lead singles are She's My Baby and Inside Out, which is a good song, and they have videos made for them. And the final single is Wilbury Twist, which is the last track on the album. And Wilbury Twist is one of those things where I think the balance of the Wilburys, you know, it's kind of over because it tilts into, they seem to be having more fun than me.
Yes.
And I kind of think, it's kind of a jocular song, and it's kind of a bit grating, and you know, there's funny comedians in the video. And
I can live with the song. Yeah. I think the song is absolutely fine. I have no issue with the song. It's the video.
Yes.
And I think once you kind of start drafting in, you know, it's John Candy, and you just think, this is, we're now outside. We're not, the listening audience is not included in this joke. Yeah. This is a joke for the people in the video.
Yeah, there's two versions of the video. One of them is very celeb heavy, and it has such luminaries as Whoopi Goldberg and Woody Harrelson and Jimmy Nail and as we said, John Candy and Eric Idle and all the people in the phone book are kind of doing the Wilbury Twist. Ho ho, great fun. It works as kind of an off the cuff album closer. But trying to push it forward as I kind of feel it, you know, the thing is getting a little bit to the it's kind of done what it has to do by that point.
Yeah. Can I say that the song that should have been the single?
Yes.
One of probably the best track on it is the Jet track. Never thought you'd hear me say that.
I never thought I'd hear you say that. Which track are you referring to?
New Blue Moon.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I think that, and I think that would have been a great single.
I'm a big fan of Cool Dry Place.
That's a very good song. That's very redolent of the first album.
Well, yeah,
you know, that's a direct line.
Well, I think out of all the Traveling Wilburys songs named after things that are written on the side of boxes, Cool Dry Place is my second favorite after Handle with Care. And that is kind of it for the Traveling Wilburys. There was, you know, ideas of could there have been a tour? Could there have been a movie? I certainly think there was scope for a tour in the universe where Roy survived and lived to see the success of the band. That, you know, when they all had that run of success in 1989, a Wilburys tour made up of Wilburys material and all that Wilburys era material would have been really something.
I think 89 would have been the tour if Roy had survived. I mean, how good would that be? And I mean, what would that have done for Dylan's career as well? You know, to have a tour where they each had 3 or 4 solo spots or feature spots of Wilbury songs. You know, you would get those hits. You would have a kind of touring band like that. It's a kind of almost like an all-star band you might have had with it would have certainly knocked Ringo's all-star band into the second league.
Well, it's, you know, we talked in the first part about how 1986 was kind of this kind of aimless year for a lot of, you know, the kind of the rock aristocracy. But by 1989, you kind of have, you know, this reclamation. You've Paul putting out Flowers in the Dirt. You've the Stones putting out Steel Wheels. You've Bob putting out Oh Mercy, and these guys start to find a way of negotiating that place, and the way they negotiate it is becoming a touring act. And you know, the particularly the McCartney and Stones tours that kick off that year and there's a Who reunion tour that year in 89 as well. They make insane amounts of money, and that's a template for the next 30 years of how they exist, basically.
Yes, because what they do is they come to terms with and they embrace their legacy.
Yeah,
you know, so gradually, you know, McCartney from the 76 tour where he has got half a dozen Beatles songs, suddenly 50%, 60% of the material is so that's you know, I mean, Dylan is really the only one that, although he's singing old songs, he's not going to sing them the way you want to hear them.
No, he's not doing it for that reason.
But yeah, they kind of, this is the path out, and maybe that's something that just didn't appeal to George.
Well, George does, you know, he eventually ventures back onto the live stage in 91 when he does the dates in Japan with Eric Clapton, and he's asked in the aftermath of that tour, you know, when he's being interviewed, you know, would he do a Traveling Wilburys tour? So, and even in 91, he's kind of thinking, oh, you know, I'd like to do that, you know, and I have my mind that, you know, would we do a solo set each and then a Wilburys set, or would we all go on as the Wilburys, or, you know, could we all sing Blown in the Wind and Bob could sing something? And, you know, George was a bit of a dreamer, really, I think, you know, that we got as much out of the Traveling Wilburys as we did is due to his dreaming and vision and his, you know, as we've said repeatedly, willing it into existence. There was one other notion, though, which was a Traveling Wilburys movie, and I'm kind of glad that didn't happen. That might have been, again, more fun for them than us.
I think so. I mean, George is very clear in an interview in 1992 that they had a director on board. They had a studio book. They were going to make a film of every song. If that's all it had been, but you know, no one needs to see Bob Dylan, George Harrison, Roy Orbison in another Goodbye to Broad Street. Give my regards to Broad Street.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and certainly, you know, you think if anyone wanted to run away from the movie business in at the late 80s, early 90s, it was George.
Yeah.
But he apparently did have a director, David Leyland, ready to go and studios ready to go. But this was with version 1 of the Wilburys with Roy on board. I think the Traveling Wilburys has aged very well. We're still very fond of the albums. You still hear certainly Handle with Care and End of the Line on the radio these days. The albums, because they were on the Wilburys label, which was essentially George's label, they dropped out of circulation for a number of years, and hard to believe, but you couldn't pick up Traveling Wilburys albums until they got reissued in June 2007 as 2 CD and DVD set. And amazingly, that went back to, it didn't go back to number 1, it went to number 1 in the UK for the first time. Yeah. There was a lot of pent-up demand for that, and went top 10 in the US in 2007. Topped the charts here in Ireland as well, and in Australia, and sold 500,000 copies in its first 3 weeks in release, and hung around as well, and is still what's in circulation at the time. Some of the other songs have appeared in different live versions. Dylan has done Congratulations at least once in concert, hasn't he?
Yes, he has. Tom Petty drags Wilbury songs out as sort of surprise items. So there's a very good version. I think it was a video concert release, a digital release, Tweeter and the Monkey Man in 2008, 2013. Jeff Lynne. Performs Handle with Care. And he has Danny Harrison as his support act on the tour just before the pandemic. We all had tickets to go and see that.
We did, yeah.
We're hoping that comes back. So he brings Danny on, and they sang it as a sort of as close to the Wilburys ever got at the concert for George. It's interesting that George didn't perform, when he went on his 1991 George stayed in character as George Harrison and did not
reveal his true self as a Wilbury.
his
That's
true
true.
Wilbury self.
Yeah, when I saw Jeff's ELO a few years ago, Danny wasn't there, but halfway through he goes in that sheepish way, I'm going to do a song from the other band, the Traveling Wilburys. And off he went singing Handle with Care. And yeah, it was great to hear it.
It was the
sung live.
Best song of the night.
Yes.
Best song of the night.
I'm glad it didn't go into, you go to some concerts these days, like seeing Queen a few years ago, and Freddie Mercury pops up on the screen. You're like,
in the middle.
Yes.
Yeah, that would be bad. But George credited himself as Spike and Nelson Wilbury as the producer of Live in Japan. And so there you go. And on tour, he credited himself in the tour program as Nakahama Wilbury, as a bit of cultural appropriation.
Oh dear, you wouldn't get away with that now these days.
You wouldn't. Have you heard the Warner Brothers Christmas 1988 promotional
I have not, no.
Where George does a very funny, this is Nelson Wilbury saying "Happy Christmas," cue applause, clap, clap, clap. Just a Happy Christmas for Warner Bros. But Pee Wee Herman appears on that as Pee Wee Wilbury. So there's lots of other Wilburys.
There's lots of Wilburys. If you look at that Traveling Wilburys documentary tape, there's Chopper Wilbury, Edison Wilbury. Everyone's given a Wilbury name in the credits except for the director Willie Smacks, which
we all thought that was a made-up name.
I thought that was a made-up name, and so Willie Smacks, I was like, oh George, you and your pseudonyms. Willie Smacks is when I was researching him for this, is a video director. He directed some great videos in the 80s, particularly for the Eurythmics, like Missionary Man and It's All Right, Baby's Coming Back. And he also directed the Bad video for Come On Man, Set in You, the one set in the fairground with the thing. He directed that video, but he did direct the End of the Line video as well. So he's the person who kind of pulled together all that video footage and turned it into something watchable. Willie Smacks. we should also mention Ayrton Wilbury. Who's Ayrton Wilbury?
Ayrton Wilbury is the pseudonym that Danny adopted.
Oh yeah.
There are a couple of bonus tracks on the sort of little box set that came out in 2007, Maxine and Like a Ship. Maxine is really a George Harrison song, and it's pretty finished. That's a good vocal. Like a Ship is a kind of slightly dirgy Bob Dylan song, but Danny and Jeff and Tom finished those tracks off. But Danny adopted the pseudonym Ayrton Wilbury after Ayrton. There's a bit in the Wilburys documentary, which is obviously filmed in 1988, and Danny's not in it, but he would have been 10 at the time. And they talk at one point about how they're just playing guitars into the night and telling the kids to go away and go asleep and just ignore, mind yourselves. So I'm assuming Danny was knocking around at that point, which is nice to think. There's a post Wilburys, George and Tom and Bob and Jeff all go off and do their own things. They remained good friends and didn't fall out of favor with each other, but there was never really any further official Wilburys business after the 1990-91 album and singles. No, I mean, I think they all acknowledged that really it was George was the motivating factor, and they were waiting for him, and Tom Petty sort of acknowledges George blew slightly hot and cold about the tour, and then things moved on. George anthology came along. You had that. Jeff is still in those circles. He's then working with Paul, and the Wilburys sort of recede into the background.
So yeah, the Traveling Wilburys. I mean, we are lucky that it exists. We are lucky that it's as good as it is. And you know, all these years later, it's you know, I think it. You know, these things are quite precarious. These super group type events, and I think quality wise, the Wilburys comes out on top.
I think so. I think so. I must admit, when I first heard the first volume, I had difficulty sort of accepting it as a band.
Yeah.
I think simply because the 5 people involved were so huge and had such strong personalities and such defined careers that I really did have difficulty thinking of this as being anything other than just 5 people larking around. But I think with hindsight, which is a great thing, I think with hindsight, I think that's what makes it so charming.
Yeah, and I think there might have been at the time a certain you know, a certain kind of seriousness that, you know, rock and roll has to have a certain type of heaviness or authenticity. And, you know, that balance of when you introduce something humorous or playful can sometimes go horribly wrong and can be really, you know, not enjoyable. And again, it's that tip of, oh, you're having fun, but I'm not. But the Wilburys, you know, there's a lot of songwriting and craft that kind of rises to the top. And I think that's what makes it last.
Yes, and I mean, I think it ended at the right time.
Yeah,
you know, I think it did. I would love to have had volume 2 with Roy Orbison, but I think Wilbury Twist is the point at which.
Yeah, you know, it's run its course. But what do you think, everybody? Go back and listen to your Traveling Wilburys records and see if they're as good as you remember them, or what was your take on them if you were around when they came out. You know, we're available in all the usual places. We're on Twitter at BeatlesPod. The Nothing's Real Facebook group is there. All these things can be accessed via our website, www.nothingisrealpod.com. There's a contact us tab there with all those links. We've got TikToks and all sorts of things these days. I don't know what the kids are up to. And but www.nothingisrealpod.com will get you there, and you can subscribe and support the podcast through the website as well. And we're always glad to hear from you all, and we're always glad to send people back to listening to the records. But for now, my name is Papa Nez Wilbury.
I'm Atticus Wilbury.
And this has been Nothing Is Real. Thanks for listening.